All right, how to close a mobile home park. So you've gotten your equity, you've gotten your debt, you've gotten through due diligence, you are at the finish line. Now you have to punch it through. This is how you go about the actual closing process. All right, so let's fire through some of the details with closing. Make sure you get this deal finalized with no errors and all the math works out and you get through closing with as little as stress as possible. All right, it's pretty simple. Once you open escrow at the beginning of the process that we talked about, the money is with the title company. They are working on all the documents. They're preparing all these with the lawyers. The lawyers are working on all the paperwork with the lenders. And then you get to closing and you finally finish all those documents and you sign them. You get the notary to stamp it, of course, and then you fire it off to the title company, the escrow agent. They go through all the reconciliation on the various accounts to make sure all the money works out, to make sure the rent's prorated for the amount of days of that month, yada, yada. Then they say, okay, everything looks good. You wire in your money. The lender wires in their money. And ultimately, the title company closes that deal. They release funds to the seller, and then they record usually at the county the next day. And then, of course, step 5 here would be the transfer of the keys. Now, this is a mobile home park, so the keys is more of a metaphor for the transfer of the ownership. Maybe there's a shed, maybe there's a community center, but for the most part, of course, you own the infrastructure, you own the glorified parking lot, and the tenants own the homes. Okay, what's the most important document the day of closing? Well, it's the settlement statement that's going back and forth with title and the buyer and the seller to make sure all the line items add up. It's essentially one giant ledger where you have the debits and the credits for both the buyer and seller, and all these things have to add up. And it's not that intuitive for the first time that you look at one of these. Maybe you saw one of these when you purchased your single family home, but they're more standard on residential transactions. Usually you don't even get involved. Whereas on the commercial side, there's just more money moving around. There's more errors that can be made if you're not paying attention. So you just need to make sure that you're working with your lawyer, your contact at the title company to make sure that you're getting your appropriate credits off that purchase price. The big one, of course, is your earnest money deposit. You want to make sure you don't pay that twice. And you, of course, want to make sure that you're getting credit for the appropriate amount of days in that month of rent, which is incredibly important because if you're getting all that rent, you didn't have to pay for a lot of the expenses, which is nice because you have to show up at closing with less capital. So make sure you're doing the math correct on the closing statement, or another word for this is the ALTA HUD-1 statement. It's just a standard document that facilitates all the final accounting of this transaction. Here's a quick example. Property taxes, say this is a smaller asset, it's only got $12,000 a year in property taxes and it's half the year and you're closing on July 1st, but the property taxes are probably already prepaid by that time. And so you would be giving the seller a credit, a prorated amount on those property taxes that they already paid that you're going to get the benefit from for the second half. And so that's kind of how prorations work across all of these line items on a closing statement. All right. So what does title actually do? What is their role in this whole process? Well, title search, that of course is them verifying all the records, historical documents that have been recorded that have anything to do with a ownership claim on this asset because you want clean title. You want to make sure that your interest is secured in that fee simple ownership of that property and nobody else has some crazy weird easement that's been recorded or anything that would infringe on your ownership rights for that property. And then after they've done that search, they're going to give you title insurance, which is kind of a racket if you ask me, but they get paid a certain amount of money based on the size of the property to ensure that there was a mistake, that everybody didn't miss something on title. So with that title insurance, if there is some sort of problem, some weird long lost cousin shows up with a deed that wasn't recorded properly or just wasn't found, then you're not going to be stiffed on this property purchase, right? You're still going to have your interest protected. We talked about the settlement statement, escrow and funds. That starts with the earnest money that's sitting at title in escrow waiting for that purchase. Then the lender's going to fund that account the day of, typically after they've checked their laundry list of last minute items. And then you're going to wire in a down payment. I like to do this a day or two ahead of time because you don't want to be worried about the money getting there the last day. You want to be focused on all the random little items that come up. The lawyers are going to be sending you all kinds of emails. The escrow agents are going to be calling you. There's going to be random problems that surface that last day. Hopefully they're not too dramatic. But what you don't want to be doing is having to try to wire the money from your online bank account. They put a hold on it, right? You're at the finish line. You just want to punch this through. And that way you're not scrambling at the bank a few minutes before wire cutoff time happens, which I've been there several times and it is not fun, I assure you. So anyways, take care of that ahead of time. Recording, that's just the actual paperwork that gets filed at the county. That is the official closing of this asset because it's not technically official until it's recorded at the county level. That typically is a day after the actual closing when the money's released from escrow. And then dot coordination, this is your lawyer and the title agent's going to really coordinate together with all this crazy paperwork. A lot of times, a good lawyer is going to be all over this and they're going to coach you and get you just signature pages because, as you can imagine, the lender has just a ton of documents that they need to sign. And there's still sometimes some last minute changes and whatnot. And so the lawyer, if they are worth their weight, they're going to get you the signature pages. It might just be a packet of 20, 30 signature pages that you can sign in advance of closing, ideally a couple days ahead of time, because you're going to have to get wet signatures on a lot of those documents. And then you can overnight those wet signatures to the title company. So they're sitting there the day of closing. And then what they typically do is they'll take the final lending documents and transaction documents and they'll slip in your signature pages, which of course you get to approve of before they actually finalize all the documents. That's the most professional way to go about closing with a big Wall Street lender or a big bank like Fannie Mae involved. If it's a regional lender, you're not really changing their loan documents and it's a more streamlined process, which once again is just like 10, 20, 30 pages with your signature block on it that you're going to sign in overnight. You might actually have all the final documents in advance of closing just because it's more standardized paperwork. And here's really getting in the weeds on this process. So this is a lot of detail, but it is a big transaction and there can be a lot of stress, especially your first time doing this. So this gives you a more detailed overview of the exact documents that are going to need a wet signature. Yes, it says schedule 5 to 7 days early for a notary. I've actually never gotten it done that far ahead of the closing. Usually 3 days is fine, 2 days even. So you can overnight the package and then you can make sure that next day that it's there and you still have a buffer day if there was some sort of problem with the delivery with FedEx, which has happened to me a couple times before. So I would advise making sure you book the 10:30 a.m. delivery from FedEx. Don't mess around with FedEx ground or overnight. Just use FedEx 10:30 because then you could see, okay, great, it's there. And if it's not there the next day, then you got to go do it again. You got to go get your documents, have the notary sign them. If you're really prepared and nervous, you can pay for the notary to do a second copy of wet signatures. This is a bit over the top because each, notary signature costs money. But I have done that before on a transaction that just could not be delayed one more day. We just had to make sure that closing happened on the right date. Otherwise, we were out of our contract and it would have been scary to have that much money and time at risk. So just be thoughtful about doing this ahead of time and giving yourself a little bit of buffer room. All right. I think everybody gets the concept of escrow and title at this point, but just in case, here's a visual, right? The funds go in, title's holding that. They're doing all the calculations. And then once you're closed, the funds go out to the seller and the third parties that are involved. For example, you probably have the broker's commissions on a line item on that closing statement. You might have some of your third party vendors that helped you with the transaction, maybe your law firm, maybe the due diligence consultants, maybe they have given you an invoice and you want to pay them out at closing versus coming out of pocket prior to the transaction. I typically like to do that because then you can see every little detail on one schedule and the accountants are really going to love that versus trying to track down your bank account statements and try to figure out which of those expenses actually should be tied to closing because there's a whole process your accountant needs to do about capitalizing a lot of these transactional expenses. Oh, and then last safety tip, make sure you call title before you wire in funds. You just want to make sure you're verifying there's nothing shady going on with some sort of scam. All right, here's your closing day checklist. Most of these things are pretty obvious. It's nice if you can walk the park the day of closing, make sure it's still there, or you can just have somebody drive the park, send you a video. Most people in this space are not doing a final walkthrough the day of closing. They are just laser focused on getting that thing done, and they just have never seen anything bad happen. Of course, it is good to have somebody check that there's not been some sort of weather event or that there's not some major flood and make sure everything's fine at the property because, of course, once the wires are processed, that park is yours. So this is your last chance, of course, to verify that everything's fine with the property. We talked about wet signatures, lender funding. You're going to be in contact with the lender all day and you're going to be pestering them to make sure they get their funds in and funded. But don't just make the assumption that the lender is going to wire funds without any contact, without you having to remind them or get them some last minute document the day of closing. You want to be in constant communication with the lender the day of, ideally a couple days before, of course. Next, obviously, confirm your wire was received. Then 2 days after closing, follow up with title to try to get the recorded deed, a copy of that paperwork to verify that it was officially documented. Sometimes your lawyer will do this for you if they're very thorough. And then this last point is something that's often overlooked. I like to have the tenant notifications all teed up and ready to go as soon as that closing happens. Ideally, the property manager already has them and is ready to pass them out if they're going to be on your team moving forward, or the new property manager who perhaps lives in the area or lives at the property is going to pass out those notices. And you want this to happen very shortly after you actually close the deal. You want the tenants to know where to send the new rent payment. You don't want to have to chase the seller down for rent checks that went to them. The sooner you can make this a smooth transition, the easier it's going to be on the tenants. And so it's just great to be coordinated and prepared prior to closing with these transition letters. And then here's a couple last minute tips. We're not going to go through all of them. Just make sure you over communicate with all the parties involved. CC everybody. This is one of those things where they're working for you. They're transaction people. They're working on other transactions as well. Yours isn't the only deal they're closing that week or probably that day. They probably have several closings that day. And so you want to make sure that you are over communicating, that you're not the one holding up the deal, that you are processing your paperwork, your requirements as fast as possible, because this is a herding cats exercise, right? You got to get them all together on the same page to close this transaction because there's a lot of parties involved. So you want to get them to focus on your deal. And in order to do that, you just have to be easy to work with and over communicate and do things early. And then finally, a couple things that can blow up your closing. Make sure the insurance, the property insurance is bound for that day. Otherwise, the lender's not going to send in their money. We talked about the wiring instructions, entity resolutions. Those are just little amendments verifying that your entity approves of this transaction. And then lastly, on the notarization, all the signature pages, make sure your lawyer and also the title company that receives your documents, make sure they actually double check what they received, because oftentimes they'll get the package. They'll be like, oh, there's the signature pages. You think you're squared away. And then the next day they go to finalize everything and they realize they're missing one wet signature. So over communicate, over confirm, do things ahead of time, and you will have a lot fewer headaches. I trust you. And I say this as somebody who has messed this up several times. So hopefully you take these tips and make your life easier when it comes to closing a mobile home park. Okay, there you go. You just bought a mobile home park. We took you from finding a park to doing the due diligence, finding the equity, and now closing. And so now in the next video, we're going to teach you how to operate this thing. And then, of course, if you'd like to learn more about our platform, check out vintage-funds.com.